Pleasure to introduce Bharath. I'm sure the folk in this room doesn't need an introduction, but for the sake of completeness, I'm happy to have Bharath here. Bharath is a professor at Cornell. He did his PhD with Jitendra, and he was just telling me that he left West Coast for East Coast and never came back. So I'm happy to have him back in the right coast. Yeah, so he's done a wide range of things during his PhD, and then also a new exciting directions on dataless learning, or whatever you're going to call it. Other weirdly supervised learning. Lots of exciting directions, and I'm actually eager to learn more. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Ali, for the introduction. Is this audible? I don't need a mic or anything, right?
No, you're good.
Okay, sounds good. Okay. So hello, everyone. I'm going to call this Vision Without Labels. It's a somewhat provocative title, but it's sort of more aspirational. But still, hopefully, there's something there about no labels. So sort of why am I talking about Vision Without Labels? So right now we have sort of made several strides in recognition. So as sort of a random sort of example, these are results from segment anything. It is essentially like a bottom-up segmentation / instant segmentation approach. So it can do segment out objects and parts in an image, and it can also segment out objects based on textual annotations. But if you look under the hood for models like this model, for example, was trained on something like 50,000 annotator hours. And this is actually for most kinds of recognition systems on the lower end, because a big part of the whole paper was in fact getting sort of a human in the loop recognition system to learn, producing a human in the loop kind of annotation pipeline. So the dominant paradigm so far has been on sort of training on a large data set to produce a large recognition system. Now this approach is very powerful, but it has some challenges. So what are those challenges? Well, the first challenge is rare concepts. So this figure is from the iNaturalist data set, but most organically collected data sets have this property that some concepts are just going to be really, really rare. The challenge is that just because they're rare doesn't make them any less valuable. If anything, often in many applications, rare concepts are more valuable to recognize. So for example, if you're doing species detection in order to track sort of conservation targets, for example, rare species are almost exactly what you want to recognize. This is not just the case in scientific applications. It's also true for sort of other more prosaic applications like self-driving. So this is a video. How many people have seen this? Okay, this is a find from one of my graduate students. It was posted on Twitter. This is Tesla self-driving. Okay, so I'm going to show you what Tesla sees, and then I'm going to show you the actual scene. Okay, so we see that Tesla is seeing all these traffic lights, like so many traffic lights come again and again. And then if you look at the actual scene, it's a bunch of traffic lights being carried on a truck. And this is obviously going to be really, really rare in the training data. And so these kinds of situations are going to be hard for any recognition system that relies primarily on human annotations. The second issue is with expertise. Recognition system domains outside of internet images usually require some expertise for the experts to label, and that makes annotation really expensive, right? So as an example now, I know some folks in this room are already working with satellite images. So, for the others, if you see some event like this, you'd be wondering what this event is. So you can't just get sort of people, annotators on the street to label these kinds of events. Right? So you need expertise to label this. So this is, for those of you who are wondering what this is a wildfire. It would look like this because there are intermediate parts where the smoke blocks the view, but when the smoke clears, what you see are these charred regions of blackened trees. So a big part of my research has been about reducing the amount of labels required to train recognition systems so that we can address some of these concerns. And the way I've gone about doing this is mostly in two ways. and both are kind of inspired from how sort of we as humans learn to recognize stuff usually with very few annotations. The first is that when we tackle a new task, like let's say we are training ourselves to do this sort of satellite image recognition, we don't start from scratch. We don't start tabula rasa, right? So we build up on a lot of prior visual experience. So the first direction has to be to use past visual experience. And the second direction is the fact that much of modern recognition treats these problems as essentially sort of off-the-shelf machine learning problems where images are just yet another data point. But in our case, we actually have a lot of domain knowledge about this problem. Often either the domain knowledge comes from sort of domain experts who know what they want to be recognized, or it comes from the system designer who knows sort of as vision researchers, for example, we know the geometry and physics of image formation. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of just illustrate this through a few different case studies. And well, I'll see how far I get. Some of these are more recent, some of these are older. I'll start with something that's sort of really, really recent in that it's still under review. So, okay, maybe I should make this. Okay. So, in terms of leveraging past visual experience, that's not a new idea. It's been around ever since the first sort of ImageNet results came out. So this is actually a slide that I show in my undergrad computer vision class, which basically distills some of the results that we got as early as 2014. Not we, but we as a community got as early as 2014, where we found that you could take something pre-trained on ImageNet and just off the shelf run it on a bunch of downstream recognition tasks, and it just works. More recently, we've sort of made progress also on self-supervised learning, where you take pre-training task that is recognition-like, but the labels are not human-made, right? So the labels are contrived. So for example, contrastive learning treats every image as its own class. So you train on this and you still get the same kind of transfer results where you pre-train, you can get a pre-trained network that generalizes well. So this is all sort of well known. But today I want to talk about something we observed with a very different kind of pre-trained models, which are generative models. So this is literally just a demo image from Stable Diffusion. I was too lazy to come up with something more interesting. So these are diffusion models that have been developed recently, and they seem to work really, really well. They are trained for generation purposes. In fact, they're trained for reconstruction. So they're effectively denoising autoencoders of some kind or the other. The question is, do they learn something interesting because they're able to synthesize such new images, or at least seemingly new images? Now, I assume everyone here knows what diffusion models is, so I won't go into the details of this. The only thing that matters for us is that the model that's actually being trained takes a noisy image and tries to remove the noise. And if you look at that network itself, the internals of that network, there's a bunch of things going on. But the fact of the matter is that the main workhorse is essentially a UNet. So it has convolutional networks. And as all convolutional networks, it has feature maps. So you can extract those features and visualize them. So you can feed in a noisy image and visualize those features. Now, why should we sort of look at these features? What suggests that there is something interesting going on? So here's an experiment. So this is an input image. And what I'm visualizing, so if you look at the internals of these diffusion models, then the diffusion model itself takes a noisy image and essentially tries to predict what the unnoised image is, what the original image is, right? So in the language of diffusion, you can get you feed it xt and it essentially predicts x0. You can predict what the seed image is. Now, what you can do is you can take an input image, add some noise, and see what it thinks the original image was, right? So T here corresponds to how much noise you add, essentially. So higher T means higher noise. So you add some noise and then ask the diffusion model what the original image was. Now, when the amount of noise is low. Basically, you see that the model is basically just recovering the original image by default. But an interesting thing happens here when you have a little bit more noise. So like in this case, sort of halfway through the whole noise range, you add some noise and you denoise it. And what you get is a different cat. It's not the same cat, but the locations of the various features, like the locations of the eyes, the locations of the ears, the locations of the paws, are not changed. Right? So this suggests that when you fed it this noisy image of the cat, right, the network itself was able to recognize what kinds of object parts there were in different parts of the image. Right? And it was able to recognize sort of these object parts, but without sort of overfitting to the identity of the cat person. Right? So
have you assumed any noise model here, or
just random Gaussian noise, like the same sort of? So what we did was we took those features. So basically the idea is you take an image, you add some noise, roughly half the noise range or whatever this time set corresponds to, and then just pull out, feed that to the unit, pull out some features from one of the later layers of the unit, and look at those features. Yes.
Is this, I'm just trying to understand, is this a surprising result? Because the diffusion models have been trained with adding noise and removing noise, which means there is consistency of semantic features between the input and output.
Yes.
So that's what you said, right? Like when you said the paws are in the same place, the ears are in the same place. That is what the training data looks like.
Yes. So the thing I'm trying to, the surprising part, well, right now there isn't anything surprising, I agree. But the thing that I'm trying to point out is that the identity is not the same. Right. So at this noise level, like you could imagine that, you know, if you add a certain amount of noise, there's multiple things that could have happened. Right? When it tried to predict the unnoised image, it could have predicted either the same cat exactly, right, which would be probably a sign that it has seen this cat and is overfit to this cat or normalized it, or it could have predicted a different cat but in a different pose entirely, which would mean that maybe it could recognize that there's a cat in there, but it couldn't recognize individual pieces. The fact that it produces a different cat but in the same pose suggests that it does understand some of those, where the various semantic features go. Now, the question of whether you think that is surprising or not is, I guess, a little bit subjective, right? You know, to me, it was surprising because I always thought of diffusion models as just doing some denoising. Right. And so it was surprising that there was some amount of invariance to identity it was learning, like invariance to sort of precise object identity.
But I thought you were going to argue that you get correspondences.
Yes, I'm going to come to that. So this suggested
that part is surprising. If you get correspondence out of it.
So this suggested that we might use the feature for something, and the thing we tried to do was correspondence. Now, why did we try to do correspondence? Mainly because I like correspondence as a problem. I've been wondering about this for a long time, ever since I finished my PhD. So this is actually a quote from Alice in Wonderland. So the Mad Hatter asks, why is a raven like a writing desk? It's supposed to be a nonsense question, but when I sort of saw the person, I thought, well, if I have a raven and a writing desk, I actually can draw correspondences between them. Like I know that the legs of the raven are kind of like the legs of the writing desk, or the wings of the raven are kind of like the flat of the table. If you ever have one of those tables that expands when you pull them, those parts are actually called wings. Now, this is sort of way too much for a machine model to expect, but generally speaking, it's kind of nice if we can draw correspondences between these source images on the left and on all these query images on the right. If you can draw these correspondences, it allows you to do lots of things. So for example, it allows you to do basically pose estimation. It allows you to do sort of semantic segmentation by just sort of labeling the segmentation in one image and propagating it. It allows you to do recognition by just matching the appearance of various parts and so forth. So we took those features that I just talked about and tried to draw correspondences, and interestingly, we found that it was really, really good. And this is just off-the-shelf features from a pre-trained diffusion model, no further training. So it's not trained for any discriminative task. It was just trained on the denoising task, and it has somehow figured out the ability to do like nearest neighbors in this feature space gives you very good correspondences.
But what is on the left? What is on the right?
Sorry, this is the query, I guess, and this, or I don't know. So you, for every pixel on the left image and for each of these images, we are looking at the nearest neighbor location in feature space. So we get a feature map for this image and a feature map for this image. And then for every pixel here, we find the nearest feature vector in that image.
I'm probably not seeing the red dot on the query.
Oh, sorry, maybe that's the part. It's really small.
What's the feature map for a pixel?
So you take the image, you add some noise, feed it to the unit, and extract features out from one of the layers of the decoder. I forget which one. It's sort of the feature map is then interpolated so that you get softer source, but basically it's just nearest neighbors.
Does the layer of the unit change the kind of correspondence?
Yeah, so the layer does matter. We didn't do a very fine-grained sort of evaluation. We did blocks. And this was somewhere not the very last block, but it was a block in the decoder, I think, but sort of maybe the penultimate or the layer before that. The degree of noise also matters, so how much noise you add. We found that for semantic correspondence, you want to add more noise because of the visualization I showed. But for geometric correspondence, you want to add less noise. So when we did these results, we did a code sweep on the blocks and the sort of noise or time or whatever.
These are all natural images, or those ones are generated?
So everything is natural, real images. We tried, so you might ask that, these are not generated images, so, what is this feature map? So we tried some sort of sophisticated inversion techniques to go from real images to the corresponding noise. That didn't help or hurt. So we were like, it's more expensive. This is just, it's less elegant, but also faster and just cheaper to do. This works also for geometric correspondence. I'm less sure about the geometric correspondence though, because geometric correspondence usually it has to be validated in a structure promotion pipeline, and we're not going to do structure promotion. We did evaluate on homography estimation. So these are some results. So one thing we did try to do was we tried to sort of make sure that when we're comparing to other feature representations, we compare to feature representations trained on roughly the same data. So these are results on two correspondence tasks. One is semantic, one is homography estimation. With comparing the diffusion features to dyno features. Both of these models are trained on ImageNet without the labels. So the diffusion model here is is an unconditional diffusion model. We also have results with a conditional diffusion model, which we or text condition diffusion model, which we compare to CLIP. But I'm not reporting that here because the training data sets are not exactly apples to apples. But this the training data sets are apples to apples. So we find that the semantic correspondence, so these models are learning better correspondences than dyno, especially when it comes to these kinds of key point matching.
Dyno V2 or Dyno V1?
Dyno V1. So I have this I have a big rant I can go on about Dyno V2. Because the way they trained Dyno V2 was to basically collect training data that matched their sort of generalization tests. And literally they did that by just doing nearest neighbors on the internet, which makes it really, really hard to make like generalization claims. And it makes also really hard. So we didn't have the resources to train our own diffusion models, which we could have done if we so we used public diffusion models and public dyno implementations that are trained on the same data. That still leaves out the model capacity. The model capacity in terms of number of parameters is, I think, similar, but they're different models, so it's not apples to apples in that sense also.
Could you tell us how you did the evaluation here? So you have
so this is from way back when the Pascal key points, which I was surprised that dataset still survives in some benchmark somewhere. So for those of you who don't know, this is like old data about 20 object categories. Not all 20 categories I used, only sort of 10 or so I used, mostly animals and things like cars. There are semantic key points manually annotated, and then pairs of images that are, and then there's some sort of post-processing done to get pairs of images and ground truth correspondence that's used for evaluation. The post-processing includes like removing heavily occluded instances, and I think also avoiding really sort of different views where there's no matching at all.
Sorry, man, I asked too many questions.
No, it's
Does this apply to human key points?
so the human key points are a part of this, right? But I should say the comparison that we are doing is not, did not include like human pose estimation models trained for human pose. So they included general key point correspondence models or general correspondence models. I would imagine that if you were, so supervised here in this case means the supervised correspondence approach trained on all the models, or on all the categories. It's not like if I was to, I don't know if I'm gathering that if you were to do train an actual pose estimation technique, that would probably be much better because it has like, it's explicitly designed to produce only those key points. These models are just sort of, these supervised models are trained to just produce features and you do nearest neighbor matching.
The reason I ask is that in your opinion, don't you think that this is a little bit contradictory to the actual generation results? We know that structurally they're in trouble sometimes, especially when they generate humans or a table without a leg and things like that.
Yeah.
If these models are good at correspondences, those things shouldn't have happened.
So, and to be honest, I'm thinking on my feet here, to be honest, but that's an interesting question. But I might suggest that all these results are still maybe consistent with an understanding of these diffusion models as thinking of objects as like a bag of key points, or like, like they might produce, they might know what legs are, but still produce like 5-leg humans, I think. And plus, and the other aspect also here is that we're looking at just the features of real images. So in that sense, we are, how should I put it? While from a correspondence standpoint, it's like a generalization test. But in terms of, if I think of like generation problem, it's not being asked to synthesize something new at all. It's sort of seeing things that it has always seen. Any more questions? Yes.
I was wondering, so these stable diffusion models have a text condition, which doesn't seem necessary for this task, but did you experiment with, like, if you have a text prompt that specifies some like part or attribute, does that affect the correspondence features?
So we tried a little bit, not that much. We only tried sort of text prompts that specify the category. We didn't go sort of specifically to like particular object parts. It's the specifying a text prompt. If I don't remember the results exactly, but if I remember them correctly, it helped a little bit, not that much. I would imagine a good text prompt would help with the conditional models. But that said, I personally didn't pay that much attention to the conditional models, even though they work much better for this task, because of the fact that it's a bit harder for me to sort of grapple with what the training set contains exactly. Okay. So the takeaway is that essentially diffusion models are not just generative models, they are unsupervised learners. And clearly they're learning enough about the world to draw correspondence. Now, to be honest, I don't know why exactly, like, or rather, I don't know how to sort of use this knowledge and sort of generalize it. So is this a property specifically of diffusion models, or is this a property of general generative models? The fact is that people have shown some results with GANs as well, and so we compare with GANs, they work much worse. But the challenge with GANs is that they don't have encoders, so you can't just feed in an image and extract features. You have to do some work for that. The other kinds of generative models are VAEs, but they don't really generate that well. So we have this one kind of generative model that's doing this, and we don't know whether it's whether diffusion is important. And there's a question of whether this is a property of the world, like just if you were to sample internet images, any kind of learning should this emerge. Like we see that correspondence emerges in Dino as well, even though it's trained on a discriminative task, but it's not trained on pixel level discrimination, but still it learns correspondence. So maybe this is just some property of the visual world. All that said, I think this is pretty neat and stuff. I still have some sort of concerns with this. So the fact that we don't understand this means that it's also harder to control. Like if I wanted better geometry correspondence, how should I train? It's unclear, right? I don't know how to change the training procedure. This is generally true of all sort of pre-training work, including a lot of the work that we've done, that it's kind of hard to control what the model learns, right? It learns what it learns and you evaluate it, but you don't have much control. So in the second case study, which is a little bit older and may seem a little bit quaint, I'll talk about sort of an alternative approach where we explicitly encode domain knowledge. And this goes, so this is a couple of years old, and it's a problem that is, as I said, a little bit quaint now, but it's still worthwhile, I think, because it's an interesting technique, personally, that I feel. So this goes back to sort of, now I'm going to talk about this transfer learning or future learning paradigm. So now it's similar. So you're doing pre-training and then you do transfer. And when you're doing transfer, you have very few examples. So for a while, I worked on this sort of few shot learning idea, which is where at transfer time, you have very few training examples. So between 1 to 20 per class. And now we are sort of back to course recognition, not fine-grained correspondence, just course recognition. And so one of the things that we wondered quite a bit was, what do we need from the pre-trained features to do this task? Right? So my claim is that what we need is two things. And this is not, again, these two things are not particularly new. We need both invariant features and discriminative features. So we need obviously discriminative features because we want to be able to separate the classes. But the difference between something like few shot learning, where you have very few examples at transfer time, versus something where you have lots of examples at transfer time, the difference is that if you have lots of examples, then this kind of a feature space is fine, where the red class and the blue class are separated from each other. But in this case, to draw a good decision boundary, you need essentially all the support vectors, which means you need lots of examples to trace out the decision boundary. If you want to be able to learn a good classifier from, let's say, just one example, then you want additionally the feature space to be invariant to some of the common interclass variations. Because if it is invariant, like this would be ideal. In this case, just one example of each class is enough to draw out the boundary. So we looked at ways of sort of explicitly incorporating invariance that we know is needed. So for fine-grained recognition, we know a particular kind of invariance that is needed, which is post-invariance. So for fine-grained recognition, like when you're recognizing different words, you really care about really fine details, right? Because those details matter. So something like averaging out the feature representation of the whole image it's not a good idea. However, it turns out that however, it's also the case that pose is a really conflating variable, right? So it should be the case that these two birds, even though they look very different because their pose is very, very different, they should still have similar features, right? So this idea is not new. It's called post-normalization. It's been there for a really long time. The basic idea is that you want a feature representation that kind of has all the different object parts and the appearance of the object parts. The location of the object parts doesn't usually matter for these problems because the location is kind of dependent on object pose, and object pose is not important, but the appearance of the object part matters. We had this idea of generalizing this notion of pose invariance by thinking of sort of doing classification using this notion of analysis by synthesis. So the idea is that if I have this, let's say, test example, and I want to see whether it belongs to the same class as this training example or not, one thing I can do is I can try to find corresponding patches for each patch in this test image from the training image. So what we can try to do is we can try to reconstruct this test image by putting together patches from the training images. Now, obviously, we don't want to do it with patches. We want to do it with features. So basically, the idea is the following. We start with, so we have this test image and we have training images from a bunch of classes. We take feature maps for the test image and the training image. So these are these feature volumes essentially. We pull all the feature vectors from all different spatial locations and all the training images for each class into one big pile or bag of features, feature pools. Okay, so this is a bag of feature pools, bag of feature vectors corresponding to each class. And we try to ask, well, can we reconstruct the query feature map from each of these feature pools? And whichever class gets the best reconstruction wins. So you can think of this as, instead of the usual approach where you would simply average together feature vector with the average pool of feature vectors and take a dot product. Here, what you're doing is, instead of just doing that simple process, you're trying to score the similarity between the test and the feature maps by doing this reconstruction. It turns out that this looks complicated, but it's not really, because when we're trying to do this reconstruction, if you allow for linear combinations, it's basically a closed form solution because it's normal equations. This is just linear regression. So you can sort of write down this closed form formula, or rather a sequence of steps for computing the similarity between a query feature map and a set of feature maps from a support class. Yes.
So do you compare this with nearest neighbor just on the original owners?
Nearest neighbors in terms of pixels?
Yeah.
So I'll say that by itself is not easy to do. So the reason is that what we want to do now, so this by itself on an off-the-shelf feature map will not work as well as if we were to train this feature representation for this classification pipeline. The challenge is that if you do that, then now you need like a sort of differentiable version, right? So we tried versions of nearest neighbors that are like softer, and this seems to work better. And the reason for that is that it gives you a little bit more flexibility by allowing linear combinations. If you are familiar with fine-grained recognition, then you would know that for supervised fine-grained recognition, the state-of-the-art is not actually average pooling, but covariance pooling, or covariance features. It turns out that if you sort of expand out this formula, it looks very much like covariance features. So it's sort of another way to think of this is that this is another reason for using covariance features. It turns out that this one is a bit more robust to this version of covariance pooling is a bit more robust to number of training examples, basically, because it has a normalization term. That's this normalization term, essentially. So yeah, so as I said, basically what you can do now is you can train a feature representation to do this. So you have this basically classification engine that, given a test set and a training set, will try to compare each test image to each of these training classes and produce a class of probabilities. And because this is in closed form, what you can do is you can simply backpropagate through this procedure to update the feature map.
Okay, there's one question. If it's linear reconstruction, wouldn't this map back to a softmax with a bunch of layers added?
So it's linear reconstruction, but the difference is that you're not taking the average full feature vector, but the sort of full feature map. And so the connection that you're thinking of is exactly the connection between this and covariance pooling. So it's covariance pooling with the soft maps back to this, but with some of the with some additional normalizations because of the pseudo inverse. So this you can train with meta learning. And for those of you who are not familiar, meta learning came and went, so I don't know how many people are familiar. Meta learning is this idea that if you have a pre-training data set, you can sample small training sets and test sets from them and pretend that this is a few shot problem, and then get some class scores for your test image and use the known labels to backpropagate. On few shot learning, for fine-grained categories, it ends up working very well. So this is the simplest approach of pre-training plus linear decoding. And here you're using essentially the average pool feature vectors. This is the best prior few shot learning work, which uses the full feature map for fine-grained categorization. But because it uses, so this one I think used something like Earth movers distance, which is a bit harder, which is a harder optimization problem and more difficult to train. Okay. It kind of works also for non-fine grained classes, but that's sort of a bit debatable. Question?
No.
All right. Okay. Okay. So this is few shot recognition, and the results are all nice, but really, so let's yeah. So really, the problem still is when I keep thinking back to all this issue of like novel scenarios or situations that are not seen in training, this is still problematic to me because you have to specify the set of classes you want. And so we want to really move to an open world setting where you don't necessarily want to specify the classes. Recently, we've been looking at this sort of problem of just from unlabeled data and nothing else can we automatically recover classes and visual concepts. So I'm going to talk about a simple sort of proof of concept on this, which I think is kind of neat. So this is going to be in the context of self-driving. So why are we looking at self-driving here? One, it's sort of a nice domain from a vision standpoint. It's kind of an easy domain. You're really just interested in sort of moving objects. It also is one of the few domains where sort of uncurated, like truly uncurated data is available. Like usually in internet domains, the data is curated simply by virtue of the fact that people choose to put what they want to put on the internet. Self-driving data is just, you drive it out. Now, so what we want to do is we want to automatically discover concepts without labels from just unlabeled self-driving data. Now, unsupervised learning from unlabeled data exists, but typically it's features. You get features and then you have to transfer. Can we go straight to the recognition system without labels? So we are going to, so how do we do this? Well, the first thing that seems somewhat, so we actually initially we had some object discovery papers and so forth, but one thing that seemed obvious to me was if you just treat your unlabeled data as a cloud of unlabeled data points in feature space, there is not that much we can do, right? How do we know what is a class, what is a concept? Like somewhere, some kind of domain knowledge has to come in. And one place where this domain knowledge has to come in is that actually in computer vision, this idea that all your data points are somehow sort of IID and sample from some underlying distribution is not really correct. Right? So if you think of driving data, you can think of the way most self-driving papers treat self-driving data, which is that each scene is independent. But if you actually look at driving data, well, how do you get this? Well, you have a bunch of cars. Someone drives to the place of work. Someone drives to the grocery store. Someone drives through the pick up the kids from school. And in the process, they're all driving the same set of roads, right? So what you get is actually, if you look at just organically collected data, you'll get the same scene traversed again and again, maybe multiple times a day, maybe over multiple days. How is that useful? Well, so let's assume that we have LiDAR scans so that we are tackling a much simpler problem. I'll go back to images in just a bit. Anytime I get a scan like this, I can actually look up other scans that were collected in the same area, right? Just using sort of straightforward geolocalization, GPS localization. And how is that helpful? Well, basically, you can figure out the static background. Right? So the points in this blue cloud will never change. They will always be never change through all the traversals. They're always the same. Whereas in this red ellipse, you get a different point in every traversal, a different sort of distribution in every traversal. This immediately suggests that points in this blue region are static. They're part of the background, so they're not going to move. And from a driving point standpoint, that means that you don't need to worry about them. Whereas the red points, clearly they seem to move, so they are movable. So you get this movable versus static distinction. There's some sort of slight math in how you compute that, but it's not really important. That's basically just the intuition. And so you can label points in a captured scan using this sparse data, where red means they are persistent that is, they look the same in every traversal. And blue means they are ephemeral, that is, they look different in different traversals. This is not a perfect signal, obviously. So you can write up the, when already a bunch of you might be thinking of all the ways this can go wrong, right? So you can have parked cars that always look the same, or you can have sort of street signs that come up because there's a construction and then go away, right? So you might have false positives and false negatives. But it is a reasonably good starting signal. And you can do the obvious things. So you can segment it out using off-the-shelf segmentation techniques, fit a bounding box using just straight up tight fitting of boxes, remove boxes that are not on the ground, so boxes that are floating high up in the sky. And what you get is an initial set of seed labels that are not perfect, but remarkably well correlated with the ground truth. Okay, so we miss some boxes in this case, like this one we miss, and this one is a false positive. So this is pretty straightforward for the basic background subtraction, but the key thing is that we use the insight that the data that we are getting is not just a random collection of scans, it has the cycle line structure. Once you get the seed labels, then how do you how do you use this? So here we use this other aspect of neural networks, which is this, which is that when you train a neural network, it implicitly does some regularization. So this is something that I haven't talked about so far in this talk, but one thing we've consistently found, one kind of approach that we've consistently found in my research is a really good baseline for a lot of adaptation stuff is self-training. Right? So you train the network on its own outputs with some filtering. So you use these seed labels to train a detector, apply it on some unlabeled scans, filter false positives using, again, this idea of ephemeral versus static. So filter out boxes on static background, retrain, do this a few times. And what you get is basically an object detector. So this is a moving object detector. So it detects moving objects, movable or not. It doesn't give you categories. You can't get categories out from this, right? So it's just a binary. But for self-driving, it's actually sort of a reasonable start. We found that you can actually get categories out if you use the features of the detector to do some clustering. You get an over-segmentation, so you can get like 30 categories, which were with pure pedestrians and cars. But it was not novel enough to sort of warrant separate research. Nowhere in published literature in the published book does it say this. The advantage, the thing that really surprised me was that what you get in this case is actually something that's almost as good as a supervised detector. So this is sort of, so if you compare the dark green plot with this, which is this approach, it actually works better than an out-of-domain supervised detector. So the analogy is that if you want some movable object detector for the city of Ithaca, it's actually much better to just do this rather than to take like something trained on Kitty and apply it off the shelf. We have a bunch of follow-up works on using this not for just object discovery, but for actual adaptation and sort of actually improving the out-of-domain detector. But I kind of like this result because it's not something I expected from the get-go. We have some ongoing work that I won't talk about, which lifts us up to 2D videos instead of LiDAR.
Question.
Yes.
So I'm assuming that the bars in green leverage much more data because you don't need human labels.
So in this case, this is actually the in-domain supervised actually uses the full label set. So there isn't a distinction, in part because of the nature of these data sets. So this experiment, I think, was on Lyft, right? We have a separate experiment in Ithaca where we actually had exactly the problem that you mentioned, which is that we couldn't get it labeled. So we just have like a massive collection of unlabeled data just sitting around. So, but for this paper, we couldn't get our ducks in.
So the supervised and what you're calling, are you calling us unsupervised?
Yes, or well, whatever, weirdly supervised.
Right? The supervised and the weirdly supervised one are trained on the same set of visual data.
Yes, same set of sense. So you might wonder that, you can sort of really crank it up with lots of unlabeled data.
Yeah, very much.
And I actually am not 100% sure whether we have empirical evidence that answers that fully. Right? I think so. We have empirical evidence that suggests that if you had limited supervised data, like if this bar was trained on less data, then obviously the gap would be larger. But that's not surprising. The question of whether this can go up, I don't think we have enough to say that. In part because I think there's a question of sort of with this kind of if you now think about this idea that okay, it's not IID data, you're driving the same street again and again. Well, the question is, what does more data mean, right? If you just drive the same neighborhoods again and again, is that actually more data, or do you mean sort of more diverse neighborhoods? So yeah, I think we haven't carefully tested that yet. Yes.
So in this case, you have different trajectories with LiDAR scans. Is the alignment, like you have to do some kind of registration?
Yeah, our robotics colleagues really help with that. So to be honest, the alignment is actually not that hard now with GPS and so forth. Many of these data sets do come with pretty good alignment. We do a little bit of post-hoc post-processing alignment, but it's really off-the-shelf alignment. Nothing particularly fancy.
Oh, I know this is on LiDAR, but potentially for satellite images, I'm not sure, I'm less familiar with that domain. I'm not sure if it's been done or not, but it seems like the same trick would work because you basically get a lot of images of the same scene.
Yes.
And it will work with the RGB because you don't need to do that much registration.
Yeah, that's funny that you mentioned it because we did exactly that. But I'll get to that in just a little bit. Yeah. So there's some sort of pluses and minuses there, but I'll get to that in just a little bit. So there's a question of, can we make this do with video? It turns out that yes, you can, because what's the difference between a LiDAR scan versus a 2D video? The difference is that we don't have 3D. But that's not actually entirely true because we now have sort of pipelines for learning depth from unsupervised video. It turns out that doesn't work exactly well right now. So it has some issues like, again, I can go into this in detail later, but basically it has some issues with moving objects. But we kind of fix this through some clever techniques that I will, through some clever engineering stuff that I'll not talk about. And we have some initial research that suggests that you can get good object detectors, again, moving versus not moving, from unlabeled videos, unlabeled private videos to 2D moving object detectors. Right now, we can only get the large objects because for the small objects, which are really far away, the depth is incorrect and recognizing that they're moving is hard. So we don't have, we're only able to get this kind of result for large objects. Okay. So I will actually sort of and talk about this last piece, which actually starts off exactly from Kiana's question, which is, can we do the same thing for satellite images? Okay. So first, let me actually motivate why we care about satellite images. Well, there are at least some people in the audience that I don't need to convince. But basically, the reality is the world is changing. There's a lot of change going on, climate change, urban development. Also, we have lots of satellites now. So it turns out that we are getting a hell of a lot of more data than we used to several years ago. And this is really a lot of unlabeled data. A lot of different scientists, agencies are interested in getting some insights from this data. But the challenge is that unlike sort of internet data, this is completely unregulated. And vast swaths of this data are completely irrelevant. Right? Most regions of the planet are just boring, to use a simple word. So we thought that, okay, can we once again take this unlabeled data and discover something interesting? And exactly as Kiana said, we use basically the same idea. Now, in this case, actually, there's no notion of movement necessarily, unless you really have very good satellites with high temporal resolution. But what we do have is change. And to be honest, change is something that's very interesting to a lot of different people. So we were, part of this work was funded by a grant that was trying to detect construction events. So we wanted to look at change events. And the idea is sort of exactly the same. So we take this unlabeled data, and what we will do is we will sort of detect events where there has been a change, And in this case, we also actually can group those events into meaningful classes. The idea in this case is that instead of the annotators labeling, trying to find change events in this raw data, we would do this sort of pre-processing, pre-learning to give them some set of like 50 or 100 kind of discovered classes of events, and then they can go through and say that, oh, this is interesting, this is not, right? So in this case, these are 3 groups that we found. So each one is a GIF, and when it blacks out, it starts again. So these are essentially road development events. These are basically forest fires, and these are sort of events where the lake is sort of drying up. So we have this initial paper that we did where we just framed this problem and collected some sort of a benchmark. So we define change events as basically a group of space-time pixels that were changed by a single semantic event. So the single semantic event is important because people have done change detection before, but the challenge is that you might have road construction going on here and then some other event going on nearby, and you want to separate that out. And that's not something that people have looked at in the remote sensing community. And also change detection is typically just pairwise frames, whereas we want to group that across time to a longer event. So it's a spatio-temporal group of pixels that are changed by a single event. We represent it using this sequence of images and corresponding heat maps. We obtained these events doing this simple pipeline, which is you first identify change pixels between paired frames, and then you group the changes using sort of pixel features. The key thing here is that you need a good feature representation for change detection. And so in this initial paper, we had basically a fairly straightforward pipeline for learning feature representations for cyclic images that was based essentially on a version of Simplia, which is contrastive learning. And once you have that, you can use the same thing for grouping for grouping the events. So these are some examples of events that we found. We looked at Cairo and California. 50 internet points to anyone who can guess why we use those 2 locations. Yeah, no clouds. We didn't have a good way of removing clouds. We still don't have a very good way of removing clouds, except for just using some off-the-shelf mask that says that there's a cloud or not. We would have loved to do something in Ithaca, but Ithaca has lots of clouds. So Cairo and California it was, and also because there were we had prior world knowledge that there was a lot of construction happening in Cairo, and California has been having a lot of wildfires. So we created a benchmark where we took all these discovered events and labeled construction events and wildfires. So construction events in Cairo and wildfires in California, using sort of metadata from public government sources. So for Cairo, we used OpenStreetMaps. For California, we used essentially a government agency published a list of wildfire locations. Yeah.
So your feature map that allows you to identify pixels of change can be trained to be cloud embedded.
Yes. Also, okay. Well, there's 2 aspects here. So one is that the part of the issue was that there's a question of sort of, okay, I'm backing up a little bit. If you think of sort of the kinds of changes you want, some of those changes might actually be correlated with clouds, unfortunately. So like a couple of things that we were initially thinking of, one was fires and the other was flooding events. So smoke. Right, so smoke, and for flooding events, hurricanes and clouds, right? And so we were not really, to be honest, we still don't know what we're going to do with clouds. So that's maybe a separate discussion and a longer discussion that we can take offline. But right now, the issue was we didn't want necessarily something that was totally invariant to clouds, right? But we also don't know how to handle clouds because, yes, for the most part, for many events like construction, we don't care about clouds. So right now we sort of pointing the point.
So because you mentioned you use contrastive learning, sorry, SimClear
Yes.
to obtain your feature representations. So there's this single work of body of works, I don't know exactly, but I think it's called something like SECO.
Yeah. So they do seasonal contrast. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you say that everything should be away from each other except if it's in the same location, then you start getting invariant clouds.
Yes, so we actually have some work on that as well. But I think it's still the case. So I still don't think that solution will completely, because of this fact that we don't know what to do with clouds. Like clouds are kind of important, but also not important. So it's kind of a questionable thing. So, but some other events. So apart, so we marked California wildfires and construction events, but there are also what is this? Oh, this is still wildfires. There are also these kinds of events that we found, which is drying up of lakes. And another very common kind of events that we found was these harvest patterns, crop harvest patterns. So, greening followed by drying out. So we have a follow-up work as well on learning feature representation for satellite images. So one of the key aspects of satellite images is that you have spatiotemporal data. So the same location observed multiple times. Now, some prior work, as Ani was mentioning, does this where they say that features from the same location should be the same. Right? But for change detection, what we realized was that, well, sometimes big changes happen, and you don't want the features from the same location to be the same if there's a big change. Like, so if there is a seasonal change, so in this case, it's just sort of fall versus summer or fall versus spring, then you don't want the features to change. But if it is some meaningful change, like a big chunk of construction happening, then you want to allow the change. And so we used a heuristic, which was to use the time. So images spread out a few months apart, we assume there's no change, so we pull them together. Images that are farther apart in time, we pull separate. There's some additional tricks, so where we do some bootstrapping. So we do this, and then we discover some events that we may have missed, and or even locations that didn't change even over a long period, and retrain and so forth. But that's something that we've done. I have maybe in 1 minute, because I think I'm almost out of time. I'll talk about this work that we're doing, where we're trying to build a clip for satellite images. This is ongoing work. And the idea that we are using in one slide is basically this. So we want a clip for satellite images, but satellite images don't come with captions. So we are training a model that uses geolocated internet images. So you have an internet image, you have a nice clip embedding for that internet image, and we are training a satellite image so that the feature location representation of that location matches the clip embedding. And that allows us to do some clever things like segment out zero-shot satellite images, like say where the dam is, where the beach is, and so forth. So this is ongoing work, but I just wanted to talk about it as a sort of seed for the discussions. I'll end here because I think I'm out of time, and happy to take questions.
Very cool work.
Thanks.
Thank you. So do we have time for questions, or we asked lots of questions? Are there any questions? We have brought through the whole day, so I think
Yeah.
we're gonna.
Sounds good. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, bro.